radio. Of, for, and by you, the people.
Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Hi, I'm Brad Bannon, host of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm a national Democratic and a columnist for The Messenger in Washington, D.C. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. Mondays on Deadline DC, I talk to the people and players behind the politics and policies that drive our great nation forward. With us, as usual, is our intrepid executive producer, Mark Grimaldi. He's on the boards to make sure the show runs on time and stays online. Today, we're going to talk about two important issues that are instrumental in the future of the United States. The first one, it's time for the nation to ditch denial and face reality. In the first half hour, Michael Surrusco, campaigns director at Citizens for Tax Justice, joins us to discuss the disastrous economic impact of dangerous weather. Then in the second half hour, Edward Theogene, Director of Racial Equity and Justice at the Center for American Progress, talks about the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling. First, though, we have this clip from Michael Flanagan, a climate change expert who talks on the PBS NewsHour about the disastrous effects of bad weather.
This week, we saw the hottest global temperatures ever recorded. That's since tracking began in 1979. What does that tell us, and how concerning is that to you?
It's very concerning. We're in uncharted territory, and we jumped up 0.3 of a degrees Fahrenheit. That may not sound like much, but compared to our record, that's sticking out like a sore thumb. So we're in uncharted territory. We can expect more record-breaking heat as El Nino builds in.
Scientific models have, of course, been predicting a warming climate for some time, but did we expect to see these kinds of temperatures this soon?
I would say our models on temperature have been pretty good. Where we've fallen short is on impacts. We're seeing much more impacts from our warming climate than what we expected. And the impacts are only going to get worse and worse.
Tell me more about what you mean by impacts.
So I study forest fires, and I've been studying forest fires since the 1970s. And I've never seen a year like we're seeing in Canada this year. This is exceptional, extreme, and we're into new territory. We have burned almost 9 million hectares, and that's bigger than the state of South Carolina. And these fires will continue to burn through the summer, and they will generate smoke that can impact tens of millions of people. If you live in downtown New York City, the likelihood of your place burning down is essentially zero, but you could be smoked out for weeks from a fire that's 1,000 miles away from New York City.
Professor Flanagan, we've seen the impact of those fires, as you mentioned, down here in the U.S. Help us understand how climate change is part of the conversation and driving these record fires you're seeing.
So as the climate warms, we're seeing more and more fire. And people ask me all the time, why is temperature so important? Well, it's because we're getting longer fire season with that warming. We're getting more lightning-caused fires with that warming. And lightning-caused fires are responsible for most of the burned area in Canada. Also, as we warm, it dries out the fuels. And drier fuels means it's easier for a fire to start, easier for a fire to spread, and it means the fires have more fuel to burn, which means it leads to a higher intensity fire, which can be difficult to impossible to extinguish.
That was Professor Michael Flanagan, a climate change expert, talking about the disaster effects of global warming on the environment. Our guest in this half hour is Michael Surrusco, who is the campaign director at Taxpayers for Common Sense. Michael is here to discuss a new report issued by Taxpayers for Common Sense, which is called Paying the Price, Taxpayers Footing the Bill for the Increasing Cost of Climate Change. Michael, welcome to Deadline DC.
Thanks
for joining us
Yep,
today.
thanks for having me.
Okay, well, we heard Professor Flanagan discuss the disastrous effects that climate change has on the weather. Tell us about the disastrous effects that that climate change, bad weather, has on the American taxpayer.
Well, it was actually a really good intro, that clip, because what he is talking about when he's saying impacts is really trying to get a sense of what the damage is going to be that we are going to have to deal with as a consequence of more frequent and intense, and in this case, he was talking about wildfires, but that is true across the board for hurricanes and droughts and flooding. And so what we did at Taxpayers for Common Sense is we set out to give try and capture all of the ways that the federal government and taxpayers like you and me are spending money today, not 50 years from now, as we talk about climate change as being some distant phenomena. But so what we are spending right now out of our pockets to deal with the effects of climate change. And so as complicated as that is, now I'm going to preface this by saying that's a very difficult thing to try and nail down to the dollar amount. But and that is actually, as you go and you look at a lot of the research that we did to do this report, we looked at the things that the federal agencies have been producing as a result of the Biden administration's executive order directing all of the federal agencies to assess their climate risk. And a lot of what we were seeing is that agencies just don't know, right? They don't have the tools. If they do start to try and figure it out, the administration changes and that work kind of comes to a complete stop. And so you have this sort of broken process of trying to figure out how much we are actually paying every year. So Taxpayers for Common Sense, we went out and we looked at things like crop insurance, flood insurance, the ways that the Defense Department has had to increase or change how it spends money as a consequence of these extreme weather events. We looked at wildfire spending and just the out of control growth of what the Forest Service and the USDA has to spend every year to suppress wildfires. And you come out on the other end of this process, we came out with this number of about $60 to $62 billion as the average amount that we have spent every year for the past 5 years on programs that are directly repairing and insuring against and mitigating against the impacts, the effects of these severe weather events. And that amount, as you might imagine, has gone up. It is almost tripled over the last 10 years. And it is about, since you start talking about billions of dollars and people sort of glaze over, that is larger than the amount that we allocate on a yearly basis to many federal agencies. So Homeland Security, Justice Department, State Department, Environmental Protection Agency. So they receive less in funding on a year-to-year basis than what we would spend across the federal government. And again, this is a very conservative estimate in response to these extreme weather events through all of the different programs that the government has.
Okay. Are members of Congress aware of how much money we're spending to deal with these weather disasters?
Well, that's a good question. I'm sure some of them I mean, our Congress, as you know, and most people suspect, you can kind of divide them into different camps. I think there's a big number of members of Congress who may not believe that the climate change itself is a hoax, and then there may be some who believe it's real, but we're not doing it. It's not our fault. I don't know like. There's no legislation that's on the table right now that speaks to. I mean, there's all kinds of things, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, increased spending on lots
Hey,
of different.
Michael, I want to
Yeah.
talk more about this, but we have to take a short break for our
Okay.
radio listeners. If you're watching us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, we're going to continue this discussion with Michael Surrusco, who is campaign director at Taxpayers for Common Sense.
If you came across someone struggling with hunger, how would you recognize them? By their
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour talking about the nexus between climate change, weather disasters, and government expenditures is Michael Surrusco, who is the campaign director at Taxpayers for Common Sense. Michael, does this this is a rather, I looked at the report you did over the weekend, and I found it astounding because I don't remember anybody trying to quantify the effect of climate change and weather disasters on American taxpayers before. And I had no idea, like most Americans probably, and some members of Congress, that it has such a devastating fiscal impact. Now, one question I want to ask you is, you talked about the figure that taxpayers have had to spend to fix weather disasters over the last 5 years, and I gather it's going up every year too.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the amounts, like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, tracks the number of billion-dollar climate disasters per year, and that's more than just what we spend as federal taxpayers. It's the entire, assessment of damage from these weather impacts, and that has just steadily grown since the 80s until we had I think 22. We had a record, like all the other climate change related records, it just keeps getting broken with every passing year. We have higher temperatures, we have more rainfall, we have more billion-dollar disasters, and so just last year we had 18 billion-dollar disasters with a total price tag of almost $180 billion. And that's, the high, gets up to, 200, $300 billion, when you have multiple hurricanes that hit major metropolitan cities and so forth. So it's steadily growing. We have years where counties all across the American West are declaring emergencies because of drought or flooding, putting a huge burden on programs like the crop insurance, the federal crop insurance program that insures against these kinds of disasters for farmers and ranchers across the American West. And like the clip that we listened to at the top of the show, even if we all accept that we believe that climate change is happening and that weather is going to get more severe and have impacts for us.
Michael, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you again. We have another break coming up. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC and our guest, Michael Surrusco, who is the campaign director at Taxpayers for Common Sense. We'll be right back with our radio listeners after this brief break, so don't go anywhere. We're not going anywhere. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Michael Surrusco, who is the campaign director at Taxpayers for Common Sense. We're talking about we're talking about government spending, the impact that climate change and weather disasters have on government expenditures, which, if you've been watching the show, is the amount is extraordinary. Michael, let me ask you this question. Last year in 2022, Congress passed a bill sponsored by President Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes money to fight climate change. And my question to you is, do you know how much money we spend on fighting climate change compared to the money that we're spending because of climate change disasters?
Well, that's a good question, and I'd have to get back to you
Okay.
to do like a dollar to dollar comparison. And part of what's so difficult about putting numbers to these things are the ways that climate change is changing, the nature of the work that different agencies are doing. And I'll give you a quick example of that. So one of the big question marks when we looked at the Department of Defense about how much it's spending on climate change, which includes wildfire suppression spending, or there's obviously the Navy has a lot of bases along the coastline, and so when you have a sea level rise of several feet, then those bases need to be moved, which is not a cheap or easy thing to do. But and many bases right now already, the one in Norfolk, which is one of the biggest ones, 2 of the 4 main dry docks there flood regularly, so they've already begun that process. But one of the big changes that's happening is in the Arctic, which of course is an area that everyone is kind of looking at when we talk about climate change. And as the ice of the Arctic melts and opens new shipping lanes, that changes it changes a lot for private industry, and it sounds like it might be this great economic opportunity, and it may be, but there are costs associated that taxpayers will incur, such as the Defense Department will need to accommodate or protect our Americans that would be traveling through these new sea lanes. And there's a wealth of natural resources beneath the Arctic Ocean that is not in any specific countries what's called economic exclusion zones. So they're sort of up for grabs. And you have these changing dynamics that affect the missions and the deployments of American forces that are affected by climate change in 5, 10, 20-year time frame. It may be dramatically different, and that's in addition to all of the effects that the Defense Department has to deal with climate change. I mean, we have bases all over the world in practically every conceivable climate that exists, and so as permafrost melts, as heat waves like the one we're having in the South and Southwest now become more intense and longer, taxpayers feel those costs because all of that is coming out of our pocket to deal with. The Tyndall Air Force Base in North Carolina got hit by a single hurricane that caused $3 billion worth of damage, and it took years, is still under repairs. So these are the kinds of things that make taxpayers so vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, because we just have so many different dogs in that fight, if you will, whether it's through insurance like crop insurance or flood insurance, or through just owning property, public property that gets destroyed.
Okay. By the way, I want to remind our radio listeners that if you'd like to see us, in addition to listening to us, you can watch us on twitter.com/Brad Bannon, or you can watch us on Facebook at facebook.com/DeadlineDC with Brad Bannon /videos. Our guest in this half hour is Michael Surrusco, who is the campaign director at Taxpayers for Common Sense. Let me ask you this question, and I don't know if you know the answer, but there's no harm asking it. You've outlined the billions of dollars that the government spends every year on fighting weather disasters. And for those of you who have looked at the news in the last couple of days, just as an example, there's massive flooding in upstate New York in the Hudson River Valley, which I'm sure are costing New York State and the Federal Emergency Management Agency millions of dollars to clean up, to rescue people, to restore the infrastructure after the rain stops. I'm sort of curious. Do you know, Michael, how much we spend every year on subsidies to fossil fuel companies?
Well, I don't have that number off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but we do, taxpayers, there are a lot of federal subsidies that exist in many different forms that support the production and consumption of fossil fuels. It's an area that some of my colleagues at Taxpayers for Common Sense have spent a long time looking at, it is a good example of how we are spending money now as taxpayers on these subsidies. For an industry that doesn't need it. I think the oil and gas industry has demonstrated that it's pretty profitable, and B, that may be creating costs for us taxpayers down the road.
Okay. It sort of reminds me of the federal government spending money on cancer research, fighting cancer, and also subsidizing tobacco farming. And it seems to me that by spending money on fossil fuel subsidies, which the companies don't need because they're making ridiculous record profits, we're just making climate change worse, which is going to drive up our costs for dealing with weather disasters. Let me ask you one last question. Are there policy recommendations that come with this report?
We don't. No, this report is purely informational. It is, one of a number of things that we're going to put out about this. And the goal of this was to just kind of begin this conversation.
Michael, thanks for joining us today. Our guest in this half hour is Michael Surrusco, who is campaign director at Taxpayers with Common Sense. In the next half hour, our guest will be Edward Theogene, Senior Director of Racial Equity and Justice at the Center for American Progress. We'll be right back after this quick break.
The Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council present the story of Tom and Levi.
Tom is the smartest man I know. He's been a professor at 2 major universities, been a teacher for over 40 years. One day, he told me that he was having problems in his classes. I think one of the students had asked the question and he didn't remember the answer. And I also noticed that he was letting his class out earlier than they were supposed to let out. And he was telling them that he was doing it as a favor to them, but I think in reality, he just wanted to get out of there. I was really starting to worry because I saw something was wrong.
Levi and I talked about how it would change our lives. but he was there beside me, and my love for him was just immense.
When something feels different, it could be Alzheimer's. Now is the time to talk. Visit alz.org/ourstories to learn more. A message from the Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council.
What grows in the forest? Trees? Sure. Know what else grows in the forest? Our imagination, our sense of wonder, and our family bonds grow too. Because when we disconnect from this and connect with this, we reconnect with each other and build family memories we will carry with us forever. The forest is closer than you think. Find a forest near you and start exploring at discovertheforest.org. It's easy. Just put in your zip code to find family-friendly outdoor destinations near you. You'll also find guides to free activities, games, and amazing forest facts. Give the magic of the outdoors to your kids and reconnect with your family. Find a forest near you at discovertheforest.org. That's discovertheforest.org. Brought to you by the United States Forest Service.
About 150 years ago, General Philip Sheridan was sweltering in the relentless heat of a Texas summer. He was not happy. "If I owned Texas and all hell," he groused, "I would rent out Texas and live in hell." Summer has always been hot here, but 2023 has been something else, thanks to a hellish heat dome that has been baking us since late spring, sending daily temps up to 116 degrees. But worse, a more punishing heat has hit us from an even stranger, unnatural dome, the Texas state capitol. That's where our malicious governor, Greg Abbott, and his GOP majority of extremist right-wing lawmakers rigged the rules to make life easier and richer for corporate elites and much harder for working people. In this year's legislative session, they rammed a nasty piece of plutocratic meanness into law that critics dubbed Death Star. It annihilates the basic right of local officials and voters to govern their own cities and counties. In particular, it empowers autocratic state officials and even corporate executives to nullify decisions by localities to protect workers and others from corporate abuse. In a cruel case of bad timing, the first local law targeted for nullification by the Texas GOP is a humane requirement in Dallas and other cities that developers provide 10-minute water breaks for construction workers. This in a state with America's highest rate of heat-related deaths and presently suffering biblical-level heat. Triple-digit temperatures kill, yet Abbott, his air-conditioned legislative cronies, and his corporate campaign donors whined that a required water break was, quote, an oppressive burden on the extraordinarily rich construction industry. This is Jim Hightower saying, here's a new rule I'd like to see. No lawmaker or lobbyist is allowed to oppose heat protections for workers unless they spend July and August with no air conditioning for themselves.
Hi, I'm Brad Bannon, the host of Deadline DC. In this half hour, we're going to talk first about the Supreme Court's ruling that bans affirmative action in consideration of higher education admissions. But before we do that and bring on our guest who you see there, Edward Thirgene, we're going to play this clip with President Biden's reaction to the Supreme Court's decision.
So today I want to offer some guidance to our nation's colleges as they review their admission systems after today's decision. Guidance that is consistent with today's decision. They should not abandon, let me say this again, they should not abandon their commitment to ensure student bodies of diverse backgrounds and experience that reflect all of America. What I propose consideration is a new standard, where colleges take into account the adversity a student has overcome when selecting among qualified applicants.
President Biden, the Congressional Black Caucus said the Supreme Court has thrown into question its own legitimacy. Is this a rogue court?
This is not a normal court.
Okay, that was President Biden reacting to the Supreme Court's decision that bans affirmative action. The court's decision last week to ban affirmative action, allowing race to be considered in college and university admissions, is just the latest battle in America's long history of fighting over race relations. This fight has encompassed slavery, civil rights, education, immigration, and political power. And demographic trends indicate that that issues of race will dominate American politics over the next generation. The High Court's decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College will increase racial tension and make it more difficult for the nation to navigate the rocky road to a more diverse, multiracial society. Race-blind admission processes will further exacerbate existing inequalities and undermine the recognition of the unique challenges that Black, Latino, and Native American students encounter through the admissions process, according to the Economic Policy Institute. By disregarding the significance of race, these approaches risk creating a wider divide between communities of color. Reverend Martin Luther King often said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." That's one of my favorite quotes. I've used it on the show before. There is a generation of fights for racial justice ahead for the United States. The court's decision to ban affirmative action is just the latest fissure in the great racial divide that threatens the unity of the United States. The fight will go on for America to evolve into a more just multiracial society, despite what the Supreme Court says. If you want to read the rest of this recent column I wrote for the Messenger on affirmative action, you can find it at muckrack.com. That's all one word, muckrack.com/Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is an old friend, Edward Theogene, who's Senior Director of Racial Equity and Justice at the Center for American Progress. Welcome back to Deadline DC, Edward. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's start with this. What was your initial reaction to the Supreme Court's decision to ban affirmative action? I don't think it was surprise. Most people thought this was coming, but what was your immediate reaction when you heard about the decision?
I wasn't very surprised either. I was just thinking about how we had a couple of good SCOTUS decisions that were coming out, and around like the voting rights and stuff like that and gerrymandering. And I was just like, they're probably setting us up for something really bad. So I had already been thinking about this, I think, for a while, and was very concerned when I realized that the Supreme Court took this case up. But it is shocking, right? Like with this decision, they've basically upended about 4 decades of precedent, right? This is like, I don't know, this is a major blow for sure.
Okay, well, let me ask you the next obvious question. Why is it a major blow, and what kind of impact will it have on American society?
It's really hard to say, but I do know that race-conscious admissions policies have really helped sort of address a lot of the historic harms and discrimination that have existed. You know, like this is part of, affirmative action was part of trying to address like the history of discrimination, trying to address the fact that not everyone could access education equally. And this is definitely like a step back, and it makes me sort of concerned about what this means for future race-conscious policy making and for all the wins that we've made in terms of the Civil Rights Act and other civil rights that we have. So I'm trying to process all of that myself, and I'm sure everyone is thinking about this as well, but it is a major blow. I think it's most universities and institutions are going to have to be now more incumbent to ensure that there's diversity within the classrooms and within these institutions. So we definitely need to focus on how we can create diversity in spite of this.
Okay. Now, one of the justices who dissented, one of the three justices, and I don't remember which one, maybe you do, who dissented from the ruling, noted in states like California, where state law had already banned affirmative action, there'd been a significant drop in African American and Latino students at those universities. Do you know if that's true?
Yeah, I actually looked at a couple of the numbers, and I think I was looking specifically, maybe it was like UC Berkeley,
Yeah.
and there was a drop in terms of like the diversity of the makeup of the class. There's a couple of questions of whether it resembles the demographics of the area, but knowing that this is a national sort of like institution where people come from all over the country, you would imagine, and it is sort of like a diverse area, like you would imagine that that would resemble the diversity of our country and who we are as a people. But without affirmative action, yes, there was a significant drop.
Okay. Well, the next question, what leeway now do colleges and universities have to ensure diverse student population without using affirmative action?
Yeah, I think we need to find like other clear race conscious remedies and protections. So I think that in this moment right now, like it's not just diversity of race, right? But there's also diversity of classes, diversity of access to money, diversity of region and location. So I think like in order to support the full breadth of the diverse country and diverse Americans to getting access to an education, like a lot of institutions are going to have to try to come up with different strategies and implement those strategies in a way to ensure that everyone can have access to an education. I know there's been a lot of conversation right now around legacy folks, like folks who've been legacy admissions within institutions. Like that's something that we also need to take a critical look at as well.
Okay. Okay. Let me ask you this question. Do you think, the president, when he reacted to the decision, suggested that instead of using race as a criteria for admissions, colleges and universities might want to try, measuring adversity in different ways. One way of doing that is, of course, income. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think that's great. And I think that that is a solve for right now, like another way to look at it. But I also think that we need to figure out how do we get to a place to talk about race and to talk about racism and to talk about discrimination and to talk about bias and all of those things and still consider those as we think about the institutions in our country and the legacy of the harm that exists because of redlining, because of lack of equity within education. So I think adversity is definitely important, right? But at the same time, I don't think we should shy away from race conscious considerations.
Do you have any idea how colleges and universities can do that without violating the parameters set by the Supreme Court?
I think there's going to be a lot of ways to do that and to take a look at, I think the adversity angle is like a good path forward. I don't have anything like 100%. Like I wish I could write the book right now and be like, here's what all our institutions should do. I do know that some of my colleagues here at CAP are thinking about those things. So yeah, I just know that they really need to redouble their efforts and really meet the urgency of this moment because it's going to greatly impact us.
We're going to go to a break for our radio listeners, but don't go anywhere, anybody. We'll be right back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest is Edwith Theogene, Senior Director of Equity and Race Justice at the Center for American Progress.
There are a ton of social networking websites, but one stands apart for a very special reason. This one.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour is a good friend of the show, Edwith Theogene, who is Senior Director of Racial Equity and Justice at the Center for American Progress. Edwith, let's try this. And if you, for folks who get around to reading my column on affirmative action, it's one of the things that I point out, and if you want to read it, you can read it at www.muckrack.com/Brad Bannon. Back in 2013, the U.S. Census released a study. It was a projection, and it indicated that by 2044, which is only 21 years from now, a minority of the residents of this country will be non-white. I think that means there's going to be a lot of racial tension, even more than there is now, as white Americans like me try to accept this transition from a majority white society to a multiracial society. And that raises, all sorts of issues, one of which is affirmative action, which we talked about, but there are also economic issues on the table. And I believe this month is the anniversary of both the federal minimum wage and Black women's equal pay day. My question to you, Edwith, is let's talk about the minimum wage. And, more generally, what I'd like to ask you about is have racial minorities, who will soon be a racial majority in this nation, are they doing better now? The Biden administration has talked a lot about the improvements in the economy since he's been president. Is that true for African American citizens?
Wow, I feel like there's a lot there. I think one initial thought that comes up for me is, as we think about affirmative action, education is definitely a pathway forward for economic mobility and building financial security and getting jobs and all of those things. So the fact that now that's going to be even harder to access is definitely going to impact a lot of the people of color's economic outcomes. So that's one thing to know, and just trying to draw that connection there. The other thing I think about, you're definitely right. This month,
what I want to pick up this topic, but we're very close to another break, so we can bring back our radio listeners. My guest is Edwith Theogene, who's Senior Director of Racial Equity and Justice at the Center for American Progress, and we will talk more about these issues after we get back from our break for radio listeners. I'm Brad Bannon, the host of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Edwith Theogene, Senior Director of Racial Equity and Justice at the Center for American Progress. We were talking about, before we went to the break, and by the way, I was watching a baseball game over the weekend, and one of the announcers started a topic, and the other announcer said, please, don't start a new topic after there are 2 outs in the inning. I always do that. I'll have to figure out how to manage those better. But anyway, this month we have both the anniversary of the minimum wage and the Black woman's equal pay day. And Edwith is here to discuss economic issues with us. I should also say that if you are listening on the radio and you want to see us as well as hear us, you can watch us on twitter.com/Brad Bannon and on facebook.com/Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos. So, Edwith, what do you have to say about the condition, economic status of African Americans since Joe Biden became president? You mentioned before we went to the break that this ruling on affirmative action will have a detrimental effect on that.
Yes, I was saying that the ruling on affirmative action will definitely have some economic implications, considering that higher education is one of the pathways to building economic security. The other thing I was going to say is that the Biden administration has definitely done a good job in terms of like strengthening our economy, making sure that there's high labor participation for people of color, for Black and Latino communities. But even with that, and even with the gains that have been made, Black and brown communities are still lagging behind their white counterparts. So a lot of the issues that existed, like pre-pandemic and pre this sort of like economic moment, still exist. And you notated that Black Women's Equal Pay Day is coming up this month, which is true. On July 27th, it's the approximate day for Black Women's Equal Pay Day. And on that day, Black women compared to non-Hispanic white men will be making 67 cents for full-time year-round work, and 67 cents to the dollar. So that's still far behind a lot of different folks and communities. And it just makes me think about how Black women are also one of the most highly educated groups in populations, and they also are impacted by large amounts of student debt. Another SCOTUS case that came out recently is the doing away of some of President Biden's cancellation of student debt. So that's also going to doubly impact Black women. And this month, you're totally right, it's the anniversary of the minimum wage, and the minimum wage is currently not a living wage. There's been a lot of studies done of like what the impact could be if we raise the minimum wage to ensure that people are able to have more money to manage day-to-day activities and more money to manage everyday emergencies. So all of this stuff combined with the fact it just really paints this really big narrative around what is happening to Black women and what will be happening to young Black women in their futures. So it's a lot of consideration.
Now, obviously, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action and against affirmative action, and the court's ruling that denied the president's initiative to forgive student loans, those will have a detrimental effect on the African American community. My question is, do you, despite those limitations, and there's also a Republican House of Representatives to deal with, do you think the Biden administration has the means and the vehicles to improve the situation, even though its efforts are constrained by the other two branches of government?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question about, I guess, the public policy process and the state of politics in this country. I do believe that the administration has a sense of the urgency around this. He's definitely, President Biden has definitely staked how important it is for him to have a whole government approach to equity and centering that in a lot of the different policies that they have in a lot of the federal agencies. So I think he does have like the interest, the urgency, the leadership to really respond to this moment where a lot of our wins are being like under attack. But in terms of the actual like political power and clout and all of that stuff, it's really hard to say, right? The courts, we right now are experiencing a very more politically active court than we've seen in the past. We're also dealing with the gridlock that exists in Congress. I mean, in order for equity to 100% be real and felt by the people, we need a government that actually works, right? And incorporates those kinds of policies that we need to make that so. So yeah, I feel like that's kind of a hard question to say. I wouldn't even know what to what to guide that by. I wish I had some intel, some behind the scenes intel of what could be possible.
Yeah, well, it's difficult. I mean, the reality, we're stuck with this Supreme Court, and there's 6 conservative judges on the court. All 6 of them voted to ban affirmative action. We've got Democrats who have a very shaky majority in the Senate, which is going to be under a lot of pressure in the 2024 elections. The Republican House, as it stands now, is a great obstacle to social change, and prospects for Democrats look better on the House side than they do on the Senate side, thanks to people like George Santos. But is there anything specific you'd like to see the Biden administration do within this context, between now and the end of 2024?
I'm not sure what I'd like to see the Biden administration do, but I think right now, just what I've seen of SCOTUS, the confidence in the courts is like at an all-time low.
For good reason.
Yes, for good reason. Not just like these decisions that we see coming out, but also some of the ethics scandals that have been coming out too around justices like Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, which are all very concerning. So I know the Center for American Progress, along with some of our colleagues, are calling for term limits, are calling for codes of ethics. So hoping to see that something happens there. And then also, I think equity should be a cross-party issue, right? So it should also be an issue that everyone is invested in, that policymakers are invested in. We're all stakeholders when it comes to racial equity and equity more broadly. So I'm really hoping that we as a country can restore public trust within our institutions and can actually make something happen around that.
Yeah, I don't see the Republican House as it's constituted being in a great hurry to do any of these things. And there are the institutional obstacles in the Senate, such as the filibuster, that make it difficult to do anything there. But, the reality is the president has some running room through executive orders to move these things forward. One last question while I have you. As I said in early this interview, we're going to have a majority-minority nation in the very near future. Do you think that will result in better racial relations or worse?
I mean, it's hard to predict the future, but I will say that we are already a diverse country. The census is also undercount for various reasons. Can actually provide us with a clear exact number of how many people of color.
The administration did everything it could not to count Latinos in the last sentence.
Yeah, so I almost want to say that we're already here, right, where we are diverse and mixed, and it's hard to call marginalized groups minorities anymore, just given the lack of clear information of what the counts are. But the presence of diversity is nothing without actual inclusion, right? So we may be a diverse country, but if we're not actually included within our institutions, within our systems and the political process and all of those things, then I think it could be just more of the same. So,
well, we're going to lead it on that note, and hopefully things will get better, because America is going to be forced to confront these changes. And we hope to have you back on the show, Edwith, to talk about them.
Thank you.
Half hour. I want to thank our guest, Edwith Theogene, Senior Director of Racial Equity and Justice at the Center for American Progress, and Michael Surrusco, the Campaigns Director at Taxpayers for Common Sense, and our intrepid executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, who makes sure the show runs well, despite my worst efforts. We'll be back soon. Thanks for joining.